Lead has been a health hazard, for humans since civilization began. In the early days, they made vessels that carried water, pipes that carried water from lead, and it leaked into the water itself, and it created big problems. Starting in the early 20th century, we knew that the lead that was in paint, when paint chips were consumed by children, they would in fact poison the children. They would maybe have seizures, brain damage, even death. So this is a problem that has been one of human civilization. Throughout the 20th century, there was a push and pull from the communities and public health authorities trying to limit lead in various venues, and from the big manufacturers who would say that it's not a question of it being a health hazard, it's not a question of children being poisoned, it was a question of the children being abnormal to begin with. That would be why they were eating paint chips to begin with. That type of fight went on. By the 1960s and 70s, lead poisoning had become a real part of the civil rights movement, and lead poisoning had come into its own as an issue.
I met Ivory Prairie on the picket line, and that's when we was acquainted. Here is a picture of Ivory Prairie committing an act of civil disobedience, where he is laying in front of a moving vehicle that was forced to stop.
How did a citizen activist who cared about kids track down a silent killer right in our midst?
He brought pieces of plaster from an old slum house, showing us something we'd never been aware of before.
That's right. Kids were sick and dying from lead poisoning, and somebody had to help. Ivory knew he had to take charge. Find out what happened next by watching Ivory Perry, pioneer in the struggle against lead poisoning. This week on Green Time.
Back in the 1990s, I was very happy to go back to work. I had a bad health scare, and thought that they thought I had a terminal disease, and luckily that turned out not to be true. And so I wanted to go right back to work and do something meaningful, and went back to New York City. I had been in Connecticut. I'd been in Torrington, Connecticut, and I went back to New York City and was able to get a job with the New York City Health Department. Now, the way that the situation was set up at that time was that there was a lot of big departments that did kind of standardized things. So there was a big lead poisoning department, and it did testing, and then it had a remediation department that went out and actually fixed the apartments. And then it also had some little tiny departments that did, a little bit extra. And it was kind of on us, the people in these departments, to really, do community work in the way that the community does it, which is that you make something out of nothing and you make a way when there's no way. So we had 3 people that were brought into the injury prevention department. One person worked in Bedford-Stuyvesant, that was me. One person worked in Williamsburg, and one person worked in Washington Heights. And we try to do community work in the areas where the lead poisoning was very high, to really make the community as aware as possible, and for them to be part of the fight. So I personally spent most of my time here at the Bedford-Stuyvesant Federal Health Clinic, and most of the time I was there in their WIC department, and I would talk to people about the lead, and then we would go and look, and we would be able to, intercede with the landlords. I'd be able to go to landlord court. If it was something that the lead prevention program could do, of course they would take over. If not, if it was something like we got there and the problem was there was all kinds of mold on the walls or something like that, and you have a child with asthma, then we would do our own, advocacy in the courts and stuff. So the thing about lead poisoning was that we knew about lead poisoning since the 1900s. By the 1930s, the paint companies were pushing back and saying that no, those children were subnormal to begin with. That's why they were eating the paint chips. And it took a number of years before the science and the public health community got back on top of it and started demanding that things change. So by the 1970s, and Nixon had brought in the Clean Air Act, and that was to get one of their reasons was to get the lead out of the air. By the 1990s, the lead was supposed to be out of the gasoline, and lead was supposed to be coming out of the paint. Now, one of the reasons that we know that at that time that we talked about lead being a problem in Bedford-Stuyvesant is that Bedford-Stuyvesant was an old, beautiful old brownstone, at one time wealthy. So at the turn of the century, the last century, when these brownstones were made, lead paint was the good paint. That was what you put in if you wanted it to look good, to last long, and all that kind of stuff. So you got a problem when the neighborhoods started to change. They started to lose the wealth. They started to be taken over by landlords, and so it started chipping and all that kind of stuff. So the lead is there, and it's a problem for the people that are trying to live there. I mean, the kind of wealth that you had in that neighborhood initially was Mr. Woolworth, the big retail person. That was his neighborhood. So these are a lot of them were quite fancy and really up to date. Everything was up to date. On the other hand, places that had always been poor did not really have a problem with lead poisoning. Someplace like the Lower East Side that had always been very poor apartments for the very poor, they never had lead in it. The projects for a long time never had lead in it. Now, this is what we were telling people in the 90s. Since that time, things have changed. What's happened is that because of the lead paint not being allowed anywhere, there was a lot of lead paint left over in things like the marine yards of the Navy. And they said, well, we don't want to throw this out. And they, so a lot of the projects actually got painted with this lead paint, like well after we knew what the problem was, and well after we assumed that there was not going to be any problem in those areas. So that's one of the things that's so frustrating, and why I wanted to make some kind of documentation of this, because when we see what's going on with Flint, where it's been another 3 or 4 years at this point that they're gone with high levels of lead in their water, there's absolutely no reason for that. There's no question that we know the science. We know how to protect people, and there's just no reason for this to continue. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we wanted to do, so one of the things in terms of getting the community involved was, the community wanted to make sure that people understood that, even beginning in the 1990s. Now, 1990s Brooklyn was kind of famous, and it's only famous because the rappers that were kind of City Journal calls Bedford-Stuyvesant hip-hop's Nashville at that time, documented what was going on. It was one of the very strange things working in Bedford-Stuyvesant was, you'd get home, there had been a shooting around the corner from where you had been, and there'd be nothing in the paper. There'd be no death notice, there'd be nothing. And even years later, when you would try to look back and say, well, let me at least document, there must be some kind of summation kind of thing, it's very hard. Most of the real life of what was going on was not documented, except by the rappers in their raps and their videos and that type of thing. Mm. So, however, so in 1990s Brooklyn, you have about 150,000 people living in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and you have about a murder rate of about 120 a year. At this point, it's down to about 12, but that's still really high. So that gives you a sense of how high that was at that time. Mm. But at the same time, that was the beginning of the gentrification. It was about almost a quarter century after Robert Kennedy had been there. It was already a quarter century since Shirley Chisholm had been the first African American woman congressman, and she had really tried to bring a lot of wealth and jobs and what have you back to Bedford-Stuyvesant. So this is a quarter century later, and the point that the people in the community wanted to make is that the people of Bedford-Stuyvesant were still living within a lot of the same conditions. The abandoned buildings were still there, the vacant lots were still there, the hazards for health and just, safety in general were still there. And there's no getting around it. As far as the slud goes, of course, that's going to be a problem. When you have chipping paint, whether it's the outside or the inside, it ends up in the soil, kids could still play with it. God forbid, people should try to do community gardens before they had really, done a look at the soil, because, if the soil is contaminated and you're growing things like tomatoes, you can become lead poisoned from that. In the summertime, I would get the opportunity to go out and recruit some of the summer youth employment project youth. And we would go around the neighborhoods and we would basically, make people aware that our services were available and we were available to do advocacy for them and to do some health education for them if they needed it. And we also gave out smoke alarms. And at the end of the season, we went down and got trained from the local, our public access station. And, the kids were able to make public service announcements for the public access station about what they learned. So that's what we have here.
When we come back, Ron has a surprise for Jennifer. Stay with us and find out what that is.
District began sinking in the boot.
Help block acid.
It does not consider girls.
Hear what you have to say. No sense, all right? The whole thing was you up there. Okay? No, it's your house. Your neighbor.
I'm almost always there now.
Okay.
I don't go out anymore.
I ask you how you're doing.
Please do not disconnect your smoke alarm.
When we first started, we got a lot of negative feedback from people saying they're just kids, you're not going to get any work out of them, it's not really worth it, you spend your time, chasing after them. And so when we went to recruit at these meetings, I made it very clear to people that, this is not a fun job. You're going to be going up and down stairs, working hard, really had really great kids. And on the other side of it, the community really enjoyed having the kids in the neighborhood. I mean, if you want to figure out a way to use government money, employ people's kids, people like that. So that's that part. The other thing that I did is that I went around to all the federal quality health center that I was at, and some of the other health centers in the area, the Head Starts and whatever, and asked people if they knew anybody that was looking to do volunteer work. Because, especially if you're out of work for a while, that's what they they tell you, find some volunteer work to put on your resume. And then, of course, people that for whatever reason are disabled or something also are just looking for ways to, be part of the community and be helpful. Mm-hmm. And I was able to find a small group of people. William Boyd and Debbie Grant were the main movers behind this. And they were the ones that decided that we should, do a public service announcement. And it was hard for us to figure out exactly what to do. I mean, we tried interviewing the doctor and felt like, there was enough of that kind of thing on TV, even though she was very photogenic. And ended up finding this woman, whose name I no longer remember, but who was very kind enough to talk to us about, what was going on with her child, and what a surprise it was to her of how the child was never really sick. He was just kept getting slower and, more kind of out of it. And so we were able to make this video with that.
I'm sad. Maybe like 5 days in the weeks, I see my son 3 days sick. Sometimes he got fever, sometimes he got headache, sometimes past maybe 1 day and he don't want to eat. And in the eyes you see all this black. When he's sick, you see that in his face that he's sick. He told me, Mommy, I got headache. Maybe in the future he can gonna learn like other kids, because he got the lead poison very high. And I see my son the whole way eat the pain, because I know the pain is like a candy. Check the blood, because it's not good that the kids get the lead poison, because you don't know when the kid is sick and you think that it's a cold something. It's not all time the cold.
For those of us who actually believe in all lives matter, what we do when we recognize that there's a hazard is that we use our government to develop laws to protect everyone against that hazard. And we develop programs to either remediate or eliminate that hazard. In the case of lead poisoning, we have housing quality standards that we expect everyone to meet, including any low-income landlord that may want to be part of the Section 8 housing program. What we expect the housing quality to be is for lead-based paint, we expect any unit constructed before 1978 to be free from lead-based paint hazards, by which we mean there should be no chipping, cracking, or peeling paint. We expect the water supply to be free from contamination and the plumbing pipes to be free from leaks. We expect the interior air quality to be free from dangerous pollutants, and we expect the structure of the building to show no signs of bulging, buckling, or contain large holes. By large holes, we mean large holes. When I was being certified for Section 8 housing inspection, you could actually have a hole the size of an 8.5 by 11. So these are not very stringent, hard to maintain standards. And yet, we still have the problem with people living in housing that is not up to quality, and we have not entirely eliminated lead-based paint hazards. We have made big improvement on it, and there's no reason why this can't be totally eliminated. There's also no reason why, in this day and age, as I've said before, that we should be adding lead hazards. That Flint, Michigan still does not have safe drinking water, that Puerto Rico, in their emergency situation after the hurricane, may face lead-based water problems in the future, that Philadelphia still has problems. There's really no excuse if we actually believe that all lives matter, that everyone deserves to have at least a minimum safe home.